The calm before the storm. The sun's rays, which had painted the world in golden hues just moments before, were now beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, darkening shadows across the road. The peacefulness of the countryside seemed like a distant memory as Carter's thoughts swirled, refusing to settle. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead. The faint rustle of leaves as they swayed in the evening breeze seemed like the only thing that could still his restless mind. But it wasn't working. No matter how hard he tried to relax, the image of that speeding SUV and the flash of Officer Hayes's face haunted him. Carter had been chief for a long time now, long enough to understand the unspoken dynamics of his department. He knew that every police force had its internal conflicts, its alliances, and its problems. But what had just happened? Hayes wasn't a rookie, he had been on the force for years, and although they had clashed on a few occasions, Carter never once thought he would see him act so recklessly. It was out of character for a man who had always been professional, or so Carter had thought. Carter tried to push the unsettling thoughts to the back of his mind, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now, they were screaming at him. Something wasn't right. Hayes wasn't just speeding. He wasn't just in a hurry. That wild, almost desperate energy Carter had seen in his eyes when their paths crossed didn't sit well. And it wasn't just the driving. There was something in the way Hayes had looked at him, something that felt off. It was almost as if he had known Carter would be there, waiting for him. That thought alone sent a chill down Carter's spine. Despite his gut telling him that something was brewing, Carter reminded himself that he was no stranger to high-stakes situations. He had survived too many to let paranoia cloud his judgment. His car hummed steadily under him as he continued along the road, still a good 20 miles from the precinct. The last few weeks of his vacation had been refreshing, a break from the constant scrutiny and the responsibility of leading the department. He had spent time with his family, visited places that brought back fond memories of his childhood, and reconnected with parts of himself he had neglected during his intense focus on his career. But now, as the night began to settle in, the pressures of his job felt heavier than ever. The peaceful surroundings did nothing to alleviate the sense of dread that had slowly crept over him. He knew this place, every twist and turn of the road, but tonight, it felt unfamiliar, like the very land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. His thoughts kept returning to Hayes. Carter hadn't seen him in the past few days, and though their relationship had always been cordial, there had been murmurs from the officers about his behavior. Nothing concrete, nothing that could have been proven, but enough to make anyone suspicious. Carter wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but his instincts were rarely wrong. A flash of movement in the corner of his eye snapped him back to attention. He glanced to his left, and there it was again, the black SUV. It had reappeared, just as Carter had feared, this time in the distance, approaching rapidly from behind. Carter's heart skipped a beat as he saw the unmistakable headlights of the vehicle growing larger with each passing second. He didn't need to look again to know it was the same car. It had to be. But this time, it wasn't just speeding past him. This time, the SUV was tailgating, staying far too close for comfort, as if the driver was daring him to notice. His thoughts raced. Was it a simple case of reckless driving, or was something else happening here? Carter's mind was sharp, he couldn't ignore the fact that Hayes had deliberately waited for him, seemingly targeting him on purpose. Was this a message? A challenge? Carter wasn't sure, but he could feel the tension rising in his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel harder as the vehicle loomed closer. There was no mistaking it now, the driver wasn't trying to pass him anymore. They were trying to intimidate him. The road ahead of him twisted and turned, narrow and winding, but the SUV remained glued to his rear bumper, its headlights blinding in the dimming light. Carter knew this stretch of road well, and he could anticipate every curve. But with the speed at which the SUV was tailing him, he realized it wasn't a matter of navigating the bends, it was a matter of survival. What if this was some sort of test? What if someone was trying to provoke him into a confrontation? Carter thought of his position, of how every move he made as chief was scrutinized, every action dissected by his officers. What if this was a way to test his resolve, to see if he could handle the pressure? Or worse, what if it wasn't about him at all? What if there was something more sinister going on in the department, and Hayes was just the first sign of something bigger? The headlights behind him flickered, almost as though the driver was trying to send him a signal, a warning. The eerie glow of the SUV illuminated the trees on either side of the road, casting long, stretching shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Carter could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, like something ancient, some inevitable force, was drawing near. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, but this time, something was different. The face of the driver wasn't Hayes's anymore. It was someone else, someone Carter didn't recognize. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His instincts flared again, this time with a deep sense of danger. This wasn't just about Hayes. It wasn't just about the reckless driving. The person behind him, whoever they were, had deliberately maneuvered the car to block him in. There was no room to maneuver anymore. The road was too narrow, and the SUV had trapped him. Carter's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. The familiar road that had once felt comforting now felt like a trap. His mind raced, trying to calculate his options. He could stop and confront the SUV, but that might lead to a dangerous standoff. He could speed up and try to outrun them, but the vehicle was too close, it would be too risky. And there was nowhere to turn, no side roads, no escape. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He was no longer just returning from a vacation, he was about to face something that could change everything. What was happening was more than just a confrontation with an officer, it was the beginning of something far darker, something that threatened to unravel the very foundation of everything he had worked for. The tension unfolds. Carter's mind raced as he gripped the steering wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. His instincts were screaming at him now, there was no doubt about it. The SUV wasn't just driving aggressively anymore. It was a calculated, deliberate move. The vehicle was closing in on him, tailing him, with an eerie precision that sent a chill down his spine. The cold, metallic screech of the tires on the winding road seemed louder than ever, a relentless reminder that he was no longer just driving home from vacation. Something was off, very off. As the black SUV hovered just inches behind him, Carter's breath became shallow. He glanced nervously at his side mirror, trying to get a clearer view of the vehicle's driver. But all he could see was the glare of the headlights, cutting through the growing darkness, blinding him. He couldn't make out the face. But what bothered him most was the feeling in his gut, the unmistakable sensation that something dangerous was lurking just behind that wheel. He wasn't used to being followed like this. As a police chief, he was always the one who tracked the criminals, who knew how to outsmart and outmaneuver them. But now, he was the one being hunted. This wasn't just a random act of road rage, it was something personal. And Carter had learned over the years that when it was personal, you needed to act fast. The SUV's headlights flashed erratically, the beam dancing across the road, as though trying to provoke him. The message was clear, this was no accident. Whoever was in that vehicle knew exactly what they were doing. Carter's pulse quickened as his brain worked overtime, calculating his options. He couldn't just keep driving. He had to do something, he had to make a choice. The road ahead twisted sharply, dipping into a valley, and Carter seized the opportunity. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing his car forward with a surge of power. His black muscle car roared to life, the engine purring with unbridled force as it surged ahead, cutting through the evening air. He didn't care about the speed limit anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting away, creating distance. He couldn't afford to let the SUV get any closer. But it didn't matter. The SUV followed, matching his every move with unnerving precision. It was like a shadow, following him through the curves of the road. Carter's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. He knew the terrain, he knew these roads like the back of his hand, but now they felt like an enemy. Each twist and turn only seemed to bring more danger, the headlights of the SUV always there, looming just behind him, like a dark omen. His breath quickened, and his thoughts raced. Who was this driver? Was it really Hayes, or was this someone else entirely? Carter had a sinking feeling that the SUV wasn't just some rogue officer trying to prove a point. No, this was more calculated, more sinister. He could feel it in his bones. Someone had planned this. And then it hit him, the gut-wrenching realization that they had anticipated him. They had known this road, knew when he would be here. It wasn't a coincidence. They had been waiting for him. Adrenaline surged through Carter's veins as he swerved hard to the right, forcing his car onto a small dirt path that led into the woods. It was a risk, he wasn't sure where it would take him, but it was his only option. The tires of his car kicked up dust as he veered off the asphalt, the sound of the gravel crunching beneath him adding to the tension of the moment. Behind him, the SUV followed suit, its tires screeching as it barreled onto the dirt path with surprising agility. The thudding of the engine reverberated in Carter's chest as he pushed his car harder, weaving between trees and rocks, trying to find a way to shake off his pursuer. The path was narrow, the trees pressing close on both sides, but Carter's muscle car cut through it like a knife through butter. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Every turn had to be precise, every decision crucial. If he slipped up, if he made one wrong move, it could be over. The sound of the SUV's engine grew louder, closer, and Carter could feel the tension in his chest building with each passing second. He glanced in the rearview mirror again and saw the SUV closing in, its headlights blinding him. He was running out of time. The path ahead was becoming more treacherous, and soon it would open up into a field. Carter had to act fast. As if on cue, the road forked ahead, one path leading deeper into the woods and the other opening up to a clearing. Without thinking, Carter swerved left, veering into the woods, hoping to lose the SUV in the dense thicket of trees. His car bounced over the uneven ground, but it held steady, gliding effortlessly over the terrain. He couldn't let the SUV get any closer. The forest was his only chance. But just as quickly as he entered the woods, he heard the unmistakable sound of the SUV's engine behind him, crashing through the brush. His heart skipped a beat. The SUV wasn't giving up, it was still on his tail, relentless and unforgiving. Carter pushed his car harder, the tires screeching as he swerved around trees, narrowly missing branches that threatened to scrape the side of his car. The dark woods seemed to close in around him, the trees casting long shadows that felt like they were closing in on him, trapping him. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about losing a tail anymore. It was about survival. Carter's hands gripped the wheel so tightly that his fingers were numb. His mind was racing. What was the person in the SUV after? What did they want? The road ahead started to widen slightly, giving him a fleeting moment of hope. But just as quickly, the sound of the SUV's engine grew louder, and Carter realized with a sinking feeling that the vehicle was gaining on him. It wasn't just following, it was closing in. His foot slammed harder on the accelerator. His mind screamed at him to think fast, but all he could hear was the roar of the SUV and the pounding of his own heartbeat. There was no more room to outrun them. The trees began to thin out, and the path ahead opened up to a clearing, a perfect spot for a confrontation. Carter had no choice now. He had to face whatever was coming. He wasn't sure if it was an ambush or just a test of his resolve, but there was no escaping it. With one last desperate surge, Carter pushed his car forward, determined to face whatever came next. The world seemed to hold its breath as the clearing stretched out before him, the night settling in. The confrontation. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he sped into the clearing. The trees on either side were beginning to thin out, and ahead, the open space seemed to stretch for miles. But even as the road widened, Carter knew he wasn't safe. The SUV was still tailing him, closing the distance with each passing second. His mind raced as his instincts screamed at him to keep moving, but he knew that sooner or later, they would catch up. The gravel path beneath his tires began to smooth out, and Carter realized that he was heading toward an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. It was a place he had passed many times on patrol, but tonight it took on an eerie significance. The building stood in stark contrast to the lush wilderness surrounding it, old and decaying, with broken windows and rusting metal. Whoever was chasing him was guiding him right into a trap. Carter's mind flipped through every option he could think of. If he kept driving toward the warehouse, he'd be boxed in, exposed. The woods to his right were dense and overgrown, but there was a narrow dirt path that led further into the trees, a path that might offer an escape. But he would have to make a split-second decision, and right now, his senses were overwhelmed by the roaring engine of the SUV, the looming darkness of the trees, and the feeling that everything was closing in on him. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to steady his breathing. Every part of his training told him that this wasn't a normal chase. The person in that SUV wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to end him. And Carter realized with chilling clarity that he had been set up. Someone in his own department had orchestrated this. The SUV's headlights flared as it grew even closer, now just a few car lengths behind. Carter didn't dare glance in his rearview mirror, but he could feel the pressure, the weight of what was happening. His muscles tensed, his thoughts running at a mile a minute. There was no more time to think, no more time to plan. He had to act now. He swerved sharply to the right, cutting across the gravel road and heading straight toward the thick woods. His tires slid on the loose dirt, but he regained control quickly, his car kicking up dust as it careened into the forest. The narrow path was treacherous, branches slapped at the windshield, and the wheels bounced over uneven ground, but Carter held his breath, focusing solely on the road ahead. Behind him, the SUV wasn't far behind. Carter's only hope now was to lose them in the woods, to outmaneuver whoever was chasing him in the labyrinth of trees. His mind flashed back to his early years in law enforcement, when he'd been a rookie, spending countless hours on night patrol in the wildest parts of the county. He'd always found a way out, always managed to find a hiding spot when he needed one. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a cop, he was a target, and his own people were hunting him. The sound of the SUV's engine was deafening now, growing louder and louder as it thundered through the woods, gaining ground with every second. Carter's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He pushed the car harder, swerving around trees and rocks as he fought to maintain control. The engine roared in defiance, responding to his every command. But no matter how fast he went, the SUV stayed on his tail, like a predator closing in on its prey. Ahead, Carter could see the clearing again, this time much larger. The woods had thinned out, and he could make out the faint outline of the warehouse once more. It loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the night sky. His pulse quickened. He couldn't let them trap him there. If he could make it to the open field just beyond the warehouse, he might be able to outrun them, or at least find a better vantage point. But the risk was enormous. The ground here was uneven, full of potholes and loose dirt, and one wrong move could send him flying off the road. Carter pushed forward, calculating his next move. He had to think fast. The SUV was almost on him, closing in with a speed that seemed supernatural. The driver was relentless, a shadow in the night determined to end this chase once and for all. Suddenly, the trees on the left opened up, revealing a large, rocky outcrop that jutted out from the hillside. It was a narrow pass, but Carter could see it as his one chance. If he could just make it through that gap, he might have enough time to regroup, maybe even turn the tables on his pursuers. Without a second thought, he slammed the car into overdrive, sending it hurtling toward the gap. The wheels screeched as they tore across the dirt, the car bucking as it fought to keep traction. But Carter's focus was razor sharp. He aimed for the narrow opening ahead, determined to make it through. The gap between the rocks grew closer and closer, and for a moment, Carter thought he might not make it. The car was too wide, the gap too narrow. But just as the rocks loomed threateningly in front of him, Carter jerked the wheel to the left, forcing his car to squeeze through the gap. The tires scraped against the sharp edges of the rocks, but somehow, he made it through. He didn't dare look back. The SUV was too close. The forest opened up before him again, and Carter took a sharp left, cutting across a second narrow path that led back toward the main road. His car's engine roared as he floored the accelerator, desperate to gain any advantage. The SUV had to be behind him still, but Carter was starting to feel a glimmer of hope. He was losing them. Or so he thought. Just as he looked back over his shoulder, something unexpected happened. The headlights of the SUV flickered out. The sound of the engine vanished. And in an instant, everything went eerily silent. The sudden change in atmosphere left Carter feeling disoriented, almost as if the world had shifted. He slowed down, cautious, listening intently for any sign of the SUV. But there was nothing. Had they stopped? Had they given up? Carter's breath caught in his throat as the stillness of the forest seemed to consume him. His hands shook as he steadied the wheel, trying to make sense of what was happening. But just as quickly as the silence had arrived, it was shattered by a deafening roar. The SUV had reappeared, right in front of him. It had circled around the back side of the hill, taking a shortcut he hadn't seen. And now, it was blocking his path. Carter's stomach dropped as the black SUV loomed in front of him like a dark monster, its headlights glaring like twin eyes, unblinking and merciless. His pulse quickened again. This wasn't over. Far from it. The final confrontation was about to begin. And Carter realized, with a chill running down his spine, that this wasn't just about evading a dangerous driver. This was something more, a test of loyalty, of survival. He was being pushed to his limit, and the question now wasn't whether he could outrun his pursuers, but whether he could survive the battle that was about to unfold. The descent into chaos. The black SUV was mere feet from Carter's car, its headlights blinding him in the dense night. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a crushing force. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his heart hammering against his chest, and his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. He had just narrowly escaped one trap, but now, staring at the unyielding front of the SUV, Carter realized there was no easy way out. The road ahead was blocked, the woods behind him were a maze, and every route seemed to lead him back to the same chilling reality: he was trapped. For a split second, his mind flashed back to his early days in the force, when his mentor had told him that, a cop's biggest enemy isn't criminals, it's the ones you trust. Carter had always dismissed those words as overly paranoid. But now, staring at the SUV in front of him, those words rang louder than ever. Who the hell is behind that wheel? Carter muttered to himself, his eyes flicking between the SUV and his surroundings. He had no idea who had sent the chase after him, but it was clear now that the stakes had escalated far beyond a simple traffic stop gone wrong. This was something darker, something planned, and it had his name written all over it. The SUV's engine rumbled ominously, and Carter's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He was out of options. There was no easy escape. His instincts screamed at him to run, but in this moment, running felt futile. The pursuers were too close, and with the terrain ahead becoming more treacherous, any attempt to escape would likely be the end of him. With a deep breath, Carter made a decision. His hands shook as he reached down to the glove compartment, pulling out his badge and his service weapon. He didn't want to use it, but the reality of the situation was clear: this wasn't just about survival. This was about making it out of this mess alive, and for that, he had to be prepared for anything. The SUV moved closer. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the inevitable. He had no doubt that the driver inside that blacked-out vehicle knew exactly who he was. He had a target on his back, and tonight, they were going to collect. The black SUV revved its engine, and suddenly, it surged forward, slamming into Carter's car with a brutal force. The impact sent a jolt through his entire body, and for a moment, everything went dark as his head collided with the side window. Pain exploded in his skull, but Carter quickly snapped back to his senses, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His car rocked violently, but he fought to steady it, barely managing to keep control. He didn't wait for a second hit. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the car forward even faster, breaking free of the SUV's assault. The forest closed in around him, but he didn't dare slow down. Every tree and branch that flashed by was another reminder that he was running out of time. If they kept this up, he wouldn't last much longer. Ahead, there was a fork in the road, a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. To the left was the steep incline toward the rocky cliffs, and to the right was a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the wilderness. It wasn't much of a choice. The left was too risky. If he went up the cliffside, he would likely lose control of the vehicle. The right, however, led toward a dense thicket. It was tight, overgrown, and dark. The perfect place to disappear. Carter swung the wheel hard to the right, barely managing to avoid crashing into the thick trunks of trees that lined the path. His car bounced and jolted over uneven ground, and for a moment, Carter felt his stomach lurch in the air as he dropped into the dip ahead. He cursed under his breath, every nerve in his body screaming for him to stop, but there was no time. As the car pushed forward through the treacherous path, the SUV followed suit. It didn't slow down. The massive vehicle plowed through the undergrowth, snapping branches and shoving aside rocks, its headlights like twin searchlights slicing through the darkness. It was relentless, and Carter knew that if he didn't outmaneuver it soon, he was finished. His mind raced. He needed to think. Fast. Suddenly, a thought flashed in his mind. A plan. It was risky, but it was his only shot at surviving this. Without hesitation, Carter made a sharp turn, skidding his car onto an old logging road that veered off the main path. The road was barely visible, swallowed up by the thick forest, but it offered a slight advantage. The SUV wouldn't be able to take this turn at full speed. It was his only opportunity to get some distance between them. The logging road was rough, filled with potholes and divots, but Carter fought to maintain control. His hands gripped the wheel tighter as he steered through the darkness, the engine of his car growling in protest. He could hear the roar of the SUV behind him, but it was slowing down. The driver must have realized the road wasn't navigable at the speed they were going. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like Carter might actually escape. But as the road curved sharply to the left, the ground beneath him gave way. His tires spun out of control, and before he knew it, his car was careening toward a steep drop-off. Panic shot through him, but his training kicked in. He jerked the wheel hard to the right, trying to steer the car away from the cliff, but it was too late. The car tilted dangerously, and with a deafening screech, it veered off the road, sliding toward the edge. Carter's pulse spiked as his car lurched violently, the side door slamming into the jagged rocks that lined the edge of the drop. The world seemed to tilt, and for a terrifying moment, Carter thought he might plummet to his death. His stomach churned, his chest tightened, but somehow, the car came to a screeching halt, teetering on the edge of the cliff. His hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to steady himself. The SUV was still coming, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator on the hunt. Carter's breathing was heavy, shallow, his thoughts racing. He could hear the engine of the SUV growing louder as it neared the logging road's end. He was cornered. There was no escape. Then, just as the SUV's headlights blazed into view, something unexpected happened. The lights suddenly dimmed, the engine revving and sputtering out in an unnatural way. The vehicle behind him came to a halt. Carter's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Had the pursuit finally ended? But before he could react, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel reached his ears. His senses exploded as the realization hit him. The hunter was no longer in the SUV. Whoever had orchestrated this had made their move. And Carter had no choice but to prepare for the final showdown. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he reached for his weapon, ready to face whoever was about to step into the darkness and into his path. The hunter was here. And Carter knew this was just the beginning. The final confrontation. The moonlight sliced through the trees, casting an eerie glow across the rocky terrain. Carter's breath was ragged, his mind a whirl of adrenaline, trying to process the situation. His heart hammered in his chest, but there was no room for fear. He couldn't afford it. Not now. Whoever was coming for him had already shown they weren't interested in a simple confrontation, they wanted him dead. The sound of footsteps grew louder, crunching through the underbrush. It wasn't the sound of a lone person. There were at least 2 or 3 figures approaching, their movement deliberate, calculated. Carter's pulse quickened. He didn't know who they were, but he wasn't about to sit idly by and wait for them to close in on him. With the car teetering dangerously at the edge of the cliff, Carter knew that staying put was a death sentence. But moving in the opposite direction, toward the unknown darkness and the approaching threat, wasn't much better. The dense forest was the only cover he had, and his mind raced through options, looking for any chance of survival. He gripped his weapon, a sleek, well-maintained pistol, its weight grounding him in the chaos of the moment. His eyes scanned the terrain around him. The rocky ground beneath his feet was uneven, but it provided the slightest advantage. He could make a run for it, using the cliffs and trees as natural cover. But only if he moved quickly enough. The footsteps drew nearer, and Carter's nerves were on edge. His ears strained for any sound that would give away his attacker's location. It was then that a dark figure appeared through the shadows, a silhouette emerging from the trees. For a moment, Carter froze, every instinct screaming at him to make a move. But before he could react, another figure appeared beside the first, followed by a third. They weren't ordinary criminals. Carter's eyes narrowed. They wore tactical gear, black vests, and helmets, with no identifying marks or badges. They were professionals, trained for a job like this. His stomach churned. These weren't random assailants, they knew exactly what they were doing. And they knew who he was. Well, look who we have here, a voice called out, deep and mocking. Carter couldn't tell if the words were directed at him or just the situation. The speaker stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. Chief Carter, out for a drive in the woods? I didn't think you were one for sightseeing. Carter's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, but not one he had expected to hear tonight. It was Detective Lyle Davis, one of his own men, a trusted officer under his command. Or so he had thought. Davis stepped into the moonlight, his expression hard, cold, his hands gripping a large firearm. He was flanked by 2 others, also in tactical gear, their faces concealed behind masks. Carter's blood ran cold. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Davis, one of the few officers he'd personally mentored, was standing here, pointing a gun at him, as if he were just another target. What the hell is this, Lyle? Carter's voice was steady, but the tension in his body was palpable. He had to think, had to stay calm. What do you think you're doing? Lyle's lips twisted into a thin smile, one that Carter hadn't seen before, one that spoke of something darker than any words could convey. What am I doing? Lyle chuckled darkly. I'm doing exactly what I was hired to do. What you've never been able to do. I'm cleaning up your mess, Carter. A wave of disbelief washed over Carter. Cleaning up my mess? What are you talking about? You're a cop. My cop. Lyle's laugh was hollow, echoing in the quiet of the night. That was before you got in the way. Before you made things complicated. Complicated? Carter's mind was racing. What was Lyle talking about? And why was he now trying to kill him? It didn't make sense. Had his loyalty been bought? Or was this something more personal? Whatever it was, Carter wasn't going to get answers by standing around. "Listen to me, Lyle," Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "Whatever you think is going on here, you've made a mistake. You're making a mistake. We can work this out." Lyle cut him off, stepping closer, his gun now fully raised. "There's no working this out, Carter. You've been a thorn in my side for too long. You're too good, too damn good. And it's time for you to disappear. We've been setting this up for months." Carter's mind was whirling, trying to process the words, trying to piece together how things had gone so horribly wrong. He knew the department had its share of problems, budget cuts, corruption, internal conflicts, but he had no idea it had gotten this bad. Someone, or perhaps a group of someones, had been scheming behind the scenes, playing him for a fool the entire time. They were using him as a pawn in a game that was much bigger than any he could have imagined. He was about to open his mouth to respond when one of the men flanking Lyle suddenly moved forward, a slight glint of metal catching the moonlight. A knife. The figure came straight at Carter, moving with the precision of someone who had trained for this very moment. Carter's instincts flared, and he drew his weapon in an instant, pointing it directly at the advancing figure. "Stop!" Carter commanded, his voice cold and firm, a far cry from the vulnerability he felt inside. He didn't want to shoot, didn't want to be the one to make the first move, but his survival instincts kicked in, and the urge to protect himself overpowered any other emotion. He was the chief of police, a leader in this community. He would not die tonight, not at the hands of his own men, not after everything he had fought for. The man stopped, eyes wide beneath his mask. But the tension in the air only grew. Lyle's smile widened into a grin, and it was then that Carter realized, this wasn't just a setup for him to die. This was a show, an orchestrated drama. The others were positioned, prepared, and ready for him to make a move. He wasn't fighting for his life, he was fighting for something much bigger. Lyle nodded to the two men, and they advanced, flanking Carter on either side, forcing him into the center. With no escape route, Carter had to think quickly. The gun in his hand felt heavier now, the weight of it a reminder of how much depended on this moment. He had been betrayed by those he trusted, but now, it was time for Carter to turn the tables. It was time to make them realize who they were truly up against. Because, despite their plans, despite the ambush, there was one thing Lyle and his team had forgotten: they didn't know who they were dealing with. Carter wasn't just the chief of police. He wasn't just a man, they had picked the wrong target. The hunt had begun, and this time, the predator was about to become the prey.